Hello guys, it's Candice again, and I'm just introducing this video. Basically, for the Women Resilience Committee that I'm a part of, I'm going to be doing a webinar. I always do webinars, but this is an exciting one. This one's really kind of authentic and a bit interesting. Basically, I've been meeting with a reverend, and we've been talking about COVID-19 and kind of how the church, so this is Church of England, how the church kind of changed the way they're delivering things. You know, they had to do video screening, live screening, you know, how they communicate with people during the pandemic, what they kind of learned. And then I kind of did a little bit more that was kind of related to me. So I am Christian. So we talked about kind of Christian practitioners and like did a bit of a kind of Bible study, which was very nice to do, like aside from work. So I wanted to share a bit of the kind of recordings here, and I'd love to see some of your comments. Cheers.
So we're going to start with just a little bit of an introduction. I'm looking over here because I've got my writing up here. So who are you and what do you do?
So my name is Alex Shields. I am a vicar in the Church of England, and I look after two churches in Retford and Nottinghamshire. So we've got a small town, and I look after two churches. I've been doing that for 4 years, and I'm 32, which puts me on the younger side of vicars in the Church of England. But it's something that I've sort of trained to do for a number of years and have now been doing in my first proper sort of vicar job for 4 years now.
Excellent. So we do kind of webinars to an international community. Some of them who may never heard of the Church of England, have no idea kind of what it's about. Some of them probably, I hope, know about Christianity and other faith groups. But what is the Church of England? How big is it?
So the Church of England is the state church of England, and I can't tell you exactly how many churches there are, but there'll be a few thousand churches. There's a church in every community in England and sort of, you know, in Great Britain. And the Church of England is also the head of the Anglican Church around the world. So because of that, anywhere that there is an Anglican Church, which is a sort of Protestant denomination, that is generally, sometimes it's called Episcopalian or Anglican, and the Church of England is the sort of church that is associated with the state and sort of the House of Lords and things in England. And so it is the sort of the oldest churches, sometimes in the world, but the oldest churches in England are in the Church of England.
That's exciting. I think it's exciting for me because I'm a business continuity practitioner, and I'll explain that in a minute. But like we deal with like organizations, but no, comparatively, some of the organizations business continuity practitioners work for are smaller than that. So it's really great to kind of like be able to branch out and have these conversations. So I'm going to explain a little bit about like business continuity and resilience, just to give you a bit of kind of background to some of the questions I'm going to ask you. So basically, business continuity practitioners focus on like keeping the business running in like a disruption. So something will happen, an incident, pandemic, crisis, and it's about keeping the organization running, making sure that the objectives that organization set, the things, products it delivers still happen. But in a broader sense, there's something called resilience, which is like kind of more holistically focused, but business continuity sit in like a discipline of resilience. And resilience is just basically about bouncing back stronger after challenges, like after it's adapting to the kind of things that happen, which is why I think it's a really great opportunity for like me to speak to you, because resilience is broader than kind of what practitioners do inside business continuity. So that's why we wanted to have this conversation. So I've got a kind of first question. During kind of COVID-19 and from your kind of experiences being in churches during that time period and after seeing what's come, you know, you kind of supporting the church was supporting communities, doing those activities. Did you ever think, from what I've described, what resilience is, that what the work that like church leaders and church members were doing was resilience at that time? So sort of that bouncing back stronger, or were you kind of focused on kind of getting through the situation?
I think we were probably focused on getting through the situation initially. I mean, the interesting thing with the church across the world, but the Church of England as well, is obviously if you look back far enough, you could be looking at the sort of the Blitz in World War II or the Black Plague, or, you know, throughout the world, there's all these occasions where people are always saying, oh, well, the church has it, as you know, the church is going to die, there's nothing left, the buildings have been, you know, bombed or different things. But I think probably in the moment, we were just like, we just need to try and see how we can support people in two ways. One was it got to a stage where we didn't have the ability to meet in buildings, which is totally unprecedented, even in those historical situations. But then secondly, actually, how can we go and support people who also can't leave their houses?
Yeah.
And so I don't think we ever thought, oh, this is, we need to sort of really make sure that we're being resilient here. But it was just trying to react on a day-by-day basis to what was happening, and that obviously was evolving on a day-by-day basis as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we always associate this kind of resilience with like strength, but actually like practitioners are like working in new organizations and calling ourselves resilient because we've got like ISO standards and we've got like regulations and certificates and all this freaky stuff. Whereas in reality, when we think of like the church and its long history supporting communities through crisis, as you were talking about, there's an extremely long history for the Church of England. It challenges the perception of what is actually resilient. Resilience is ability to bounce back after time. Well, I see an organization, I see a group here that have been doing that for a significantly longer time than the discipline has even existed. So yeah, really interesting to kind of get that perception that actually there are historical organizations and groups that have been running for many, many years that we could be learning from that maybe don't use some terminology as practitioners are making up nowadays. So kind of we started speaking a little bit about like the activities that kind of changed because people couldn't come into church, And for me, I still love the live screen at church when I have to look after my small child and she's decided, no, mummy, I don't want to go to church today, for example. We'll be at home, we'll watch it at home. But kind of what activities and changes were kind of made during that time, and did any of them stick around? So we know live screens stuck around, but kind of how did you approach having to learn all these new things and like make those kind of decisions on what needed to be done and like all this kind of unprecedented way of doing things?
Yeah. So, I mean, starting with worship, which doesn't always seem to be the most significant thing to people, but obviously what churches have always done is been places that are open and places that people can go to for safety, for security, whether that be on a Sunday or whether that be to light a candle or something. All of that suddenly not being there, the major thing that we want to do is to do that. And so it's hard to put into words trying to think about how ill-prepared churches were for this, just in the sense of you've got buildings that could be 800, 900 years old, some without electricity, certainly without internet, and usually a sort of volunteer workforce with an average age of probably about 70 or 80. So we couldn't be less prepared in that sense. I mean, where I was in Worksop, where I was a curate, we had quite a modern building. But then even coming here just after COVID, when things were still opening up, we're then trying to set things up in such a way that means we can look after the building. So that might be 5G internet rather than broadband that's wired in. It's sort of buying cameras, it's buying setup, and just learning on a day-to-day basis how you do this with all these limitations. So one was definitely we need to try and make sure that the presence of the church can be there. But then also it was about, well, how can we make sure that the sort of community of the church is there? And so at a simple level, very early on, we had, a lot of our sort of leaders and a lot of our volunteers each had a list of sort of 10 people who they were then contacting on at least a weekly basis. So does someone need help with the shopping? Does somebody need help? Do they need someone to talk to? So there's the sort of public stuff that we're doing. There's the individual sort of pastoral care and things like, do we need to do some shopping for somebody? And then there's the community stuff as well. So when we had children who we were connected to through the school, we were trying to sort of deliver craft activities to their house. We started a sort of lunch project where we would sort of be making people lunches and getting donations from a local sandwich company to sort of deliver people meals. And a lot of those things did continue till after COVID. Some of the online services still continue. Members were sort of buying people all the sort of smart new sort of Facebook cameras that sort of track movement and things, basically in order to be able to have people ask for, Alexa to start playing them a service or whatever. And the Church of England more broadly still does a weekly online service filmed in a different place around the country every week. So I think it really just made the church think about what's important. And that wasn't just, we want to do a service, which could be for hundreds of people or it could be for 5 people. But it was more broadly, it was, well, what's the needs of the people around us? And those who can't leave the house, those who are ill, those who are maybe on furlough, it was then trying to sort of go to them in a way that we always talk about, but actually we were really needing to do in a practical way because they literally couldn't come to us.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know what? That's raised some like really interesting points for me. I think like there's that side that's like very practitioner led, like we always think about, is like the infrastructure. You know, I've worked in local authority, I've worked in that kind of like military space, and like UK infrastructure of buildings and technology and equipment. I mean, now I'm working in a tech company, so I know a little bit more about that. It's one of these things that we don't really think about, you know, of like these aging equipment and this type of stuff and how that kind of affects it. So there's that kind of mindset I'm having of like, in the practitioner space, we'd be like, oh yes, we'd have a risk register and we'd kind of know about all these things, but actually it depends on the challenge. Like this was unprecedented, as you said, like, you know, the church has got through like blitz and, you know, plagues and this type of stuff, but actually not being allowed outside of your house, you know, you can't rely on it. You can't rely on the infrastructure, and you're having to make broad sweeping changes when there isn't. I think at that time there wasn't loads of information about, you know, especially like at the shops when you go into Currys, for example, to just pop in and get a webcam. You know, they weren't tailoring their communication to the older generation, for example. And we do see adverts about like a little Alexa video thing, but they weren't tailoring that to the older generation. We didn't see a lot of what I'm seeing now on YouTube. I love a tech program on YouTube. A lot of shows like targeted towards that generation to help upskill them and get them involved. But then there's also that side of me that's like, actually, you were doing so much more. The church is doing so much more than we do in organisations for our people. You know, I was working. I'd only just started there. It was my first week, and the pandemic hit. I got my laptop, and that was it. And it didn't work, and I couldn't take it back in. So I was using my PlayStation. I was casting from my work mobile phone to my PlayStation to do work. It was the stupidest thing you could ever imagine. So the technology wasn't there. But actually, like my whole role in business continuity was to help decide who was going to be on furlough and who wasn't. There was no aspect of that was related to people management, you know, like ensuring and supporting HR and those teams in like making sure those people are okay. Because for some individuals, and you'll know this from doing lots of pastoral care, you know, coming into work is sometimes the only place they're speaking to people. Like it may be someone who's a widow or widower, maybe someone in the older generation, and even young people nowadays have a real sense of isolation and loneliness. And the church and other faith groups do so much for those individuals, and I don't really see that replicated at work. Like I think we have like loads of engagement networks and this type of stuff, but none of them that touch that kind of like individual centric level. But I think it's about what's appropriate within work and like how people find the community. So it is really different, but definitely a challenge for me when I'm thinking about, you know, the building's shut, I'm going to send everyone home. You know, I'm now starting to think, you know, do we have vulnerable people at work who have social isolation that this won't actually suit for a long time? So yeah, definitely something you've challenged me on. But I do think it makes it really clear that the kind of activities that like the church is doing to support people are so critical. And it's not just a case of, you know, only on a Sunday. This is every single day of someone's working arrangement. So yeah, love that. So I do have another question. So some people might know the Church of England. Obviously, we've kind of talked a little bit about that. What's the church's kind of like mission and vision? Like we in organizations, we have values, right? And like our values, we have like big ones set, like the CEO sets values for the organization. Like we as like practitioners, we set objectives that our program of work is delivered. But like I've never really had an incident where, you know, we've closed a building or something's happened, we're going through the pandemic, where we ever really decided our approach using our values, you know, saying, you know, as an organization, we want to act with integrity, we want collaborative innovation. You know, I've never really seen that as the starting point for deciding what to do. I think hopefully it's going to be different in the church perspective because you're led by faith-based organisation. But what's the kind of mission and value of and vision of the church, and how does that kind of feed into like when you have to make decisions about how to support people?
I mean, in the Church of England in particular, there's obviously broader sort of Christian ideas, and then that sort of filters down. So the Church of England has always expressed a mission to have a Christian presence in every community, and so obviously there was a question there about, well, what's a community when people aren't out and about? And then at a more local level, in our diocese, which there's many sort of, the Church of England is sort of segmented into sort of almost like councils or areas. The approach was about growing disciples, so helping people even in different situations in life, different ages, to be people who their faith is something which really helps them. And then at a local level, we often think about actually this being a place that is about love and welcome for everybody, a place that sort of breaks down barriers, that isn't just for the sort of select few. And so as you sort of go up that, you think, well, how do we continue to make this place open, even if it isn't open? How do we continue to provide community when there isn't the possibility of community? But also fundamentally, people think about sort of Jesus talking about the golden rule of sort of loving your neighbour as yourself. I think that is, in one generation to another, that is always the church's mission. It's always about expressing a love which is greater than ourselves, but something which breaks down barriers and walls rather than puts them up. And so sometimes that can be really helpful. Sometimes, again, you're not always thinking about it through exactly that lens. But really, for me, it's a question of, is this going to make it easier for people to come and engage with the church, or is it going to make it harder? And the picture that people have is often, well, this is an institution, this is this sort of scary building that I don't want to go into. So how can we sort of literally as well as figuratively open the doors, be welcoming? Now, for instance, after COVID, we see a lot of younger people who maybe haven't had any sort of church background. It used to be that if you were much older than I am, that people had gone to Sunday school as a child. And so maybe they've got a lot of sort of baggage when it comes to faith. They've been told they have to live a particular way, that there's particular rules. They were forced to go to church or whatever. Now, actually, increasingly, people have never heard about Christianity, the church, the Bible, Jesus. And so the question becomes not so much about speaking the language that we're familiar with, but being able to explain for the first time what that's about. And things like that, I think the Church of England have suddenly got a lot better at. Like any institution, things move very slowly, and it can be sort of, change can come very slowly. But things like social media, being able to sort of put stuff which is sort of both entertaining and sort of informational, I think is really important. But most of what we're doing is just individual relationships. People coming and having a conversation, meeting them for a coffee, or whether that be on Zoom or whatever, and realizing that actually in today's world, it's not simple for somebody to walk into a building, to sit down, to sort of book in an appointment to come and meet with you. That often needs to be, they've sent an email to a generic email address asking a question, and then trying to find an appropriate way with their maybe fears about their health or social anxiety. How can you come alongside somebody in a way that is digital and virtual, rather than making them feel like they have to come to this one place at this one time, and if they don't, then sorry, we're not here, we're not open. That has been a big shift, I think. But all of that comes from that value of wanting to be, for every person and for every community, a place that is safe, that's welcoming, and tells them a story about what we believe as well.
Do you know what? I really like that, and it gives me like loads of comfort and loads of like ideas of how to innovate what I'm doing in my life as well, because it's that diversification. We always hear this thing about single point of contact, single point of truth, single point of the way we're doing things, but really what that just leads to is like us telling people they have to conform to a certain way of like feeding in and getting information. We live in such a diverse way. We've got so many diverse cultures. Like, we're privileged to have that in England, that, maybe it's incidents like COVID that show us that actually we've been missing the mark on these individuals who are stuck in hospital and can't hear the service, and it highlights to us the areas of weakness we have, that then we can speak into and do more. And I think it is great that that's come from the kind of values and mission of the Church of England to live that. And I think it's something I challenge practitioners to do for like their working area, to be like, well, who misses out on what I'm delivering and getting involved with us and being able to, give diversity of thought for us to have a better instant response to better outcomes. Like, who am I missing by having not lead starting with our values rather than our objectives? So something really, really interesting. So I'm going to kind of have more of a broader conversation. So I used to work in local government, and we were doing kind of the emergency planning and response. So we used to do like help the response, so coordinate with like category 1 responders, so the police and fire, when like building collapses happen, large fires, Grenfell, all these horrible things. And it was one of the cases that whenever we had an incident, we were speaking so regularly to like faith leaders and this type of thing, and people felt bolstered by those groups and institutions like being involved. Like they felt more comforted by them than, for example, the wonderful adult and child social care that we have as part of the local authority. But why do you think people turn to and have historically turned to kind of faith communities and like faith leaders during times of uncertainty? And it's not in a way to disparage the government and the wonderful work that I'm sure they're confident that they're doing, but it's just a case of like, why do you think people feel like they're able to be more emotive about kind of how they feel and get more like individualized support from their church, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that there's a long history of when we look at things like the sort of the NHS, or when we look at the sort of the state being a support. Sorry, I've got a cat on me.
That's fine, love a cat.
A lot of the foundations of that stuff in the 20th century was connected to the Church of England. William Temple, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, was very sort of involved in the setting up of some of those government infrastructures. But the church is able to do, and and other faiths as well, charities carry a lot of the load. Sometimes through, maybe a little bit less bureaucracy, but also just because of that sort of personal touch in the community.
Yeah.
That might be that it's a central space that is sort of firm as a foundation, and that might be the faith element as well. Whether it be sort of wanting a quiet moment, whether it be lighting a candle. I think when I was in this job, which was just coming after COVID, I started in 2022. Not 6 months in, we had the death of the Queen.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And that was something where there literally is, similarly, a sort of Church of England sort of national plan, which we were just sort of waiting for, which was rolled out. And there was a specification that actually churches should try and be open, that they should try and have, a few different things, sort of a photo. And so suddenly we're scrambling around at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. But it was in order that the next day you've got people streaming into churches, because it's just the place that you go to. Yeah, it's just the sort of, this is the place where people go to, where they're able to receive help, where they're able to sort of have a bit of quiet, where they are connected to history. I'd say that would be the same in any culture, but particularly for, as I say, having buildings that are 750, 800, 900 years old, it's hard to get a sense of community and history without taking those places into consideration. And the fact that those are actually sort of living communities as well. They're not just sort of museums to an age gone by, but they're places that are continually reinventing themselves. I think that becomes really important, that people want that connection. And so, now not a day goes by without having some glimpse of that. Someone who, we often have older people who maybe their partner has been diagnosed with dementia, and actually they just need somewhere where they can come to sort of be themselves and have a bit of stability. Or the other day I had a young person who came and said, I just don't really know what I'm doing with my life, and I just like a bit of direction. That is what the church is there for. And I think the perception can be that it's some sort of money-grabbing institution that is rich, and, I think people assume that churches have got loads of money and that they sort of, the government looks after them. And none of those things are true. I compare it much more to running a charity, and we are a charity. These are, small organisations which are funded by the public, which are sort of reliant on donations, but are there to give back to the community. And in the best cases, they are at the centre of the community, and they're able to do that. And that isn't always the case. That might not always be the case, but they are just places that people want to come and receive support from. And so the job of the church is to do that. I think it was that William Temple who was involved in the sort of the setting up of the benefit state, who said the church is the only institution which exists for the people outside of it, completely for the benefit of people who aren't yet members, because it is that's what the church is here to be.
And do you know what? I think it's something that organizations who are trying to build themselves like a brand and trying to serve the people need to really kind of turn their eyes to, like, instead of looking at like the immediate present, they need to be looking at the organizations who have historically held and maintained trust through that time, and seeing that actually it's because of the changes that keep on making. I think this is one of the things that people really get stuck on, is this idea of continual improvement. It's not saying we're not good enough. It's not saying we're not working hard enough. It's saying that we need to continually adapt and change to meet the needs of a growing and changing society. So yeah, I really love that. I think like one of my questions as well is like, in like things like COVID and other incidents, and as you mentioned, like the death of the Queen, there's a lot of information coming from the government, social media. It can feel so daunting, especially to individuals who are already feeling vulnerable. Do you find when you're supporting individuals like and your church community that people need more information, like coming from the mouths of those they trust, or more reassurance?
It's certainly a little bit of both. And I think of the two, probably reassurance comes first, just in the sense that you need to know who you can trust. And obviously, as we live now in times where we've got sort of misinformation through AI
100%.
and things like that, it can be very difficult to know what's real. And so actually having, whether that's virtually or physically, but having a place that is grounded in history and is real, I think gives that reassurance. Through that, we've got the opportunity to share information, to pass on things, to, we've variously sort of had coffee mornings where we've had people dropping in from the council or from the fire service or from charities. There are lots of places now which really helpfully are connected through social prescribing. So if someone sort of goes to their GP, they're able to then be linked up with a sort of a community to give them support. And so the two go hand in hand, really. We tend to find that someone might come in a time of need where, maybe through the death of a loved one or through a connection that we've made through some sort of family occasion. And being around the people is what's important. But as we're talking, I remember we had a conversation with someone who we discovered that they needed some help with sort of insulation in their house. And we knew that we had a connection through the council to a sort of Age UK contact.
Oh, wow.
And we were able to make that, and they realised that they were able to get grants then to help with sort of damp and mould and insulation. Things like that. It's not the sort of... If we just put up a sign saying, come in and learn about damp and mould and insulation, people don't do that. But what we generally do is have a sign that says, come in for a free coffee. And actually, that means that people do come. And because it's not, we're here to solve all your problems, actually, people then do open up because they know you haven't got an agenda. And I think the difficult thing is if we start off with, well, I've got all the solutions, then people can be suspicious of that. Obviously, it's much easier. It's much easier to realise we haven't got all the solutions when we're not dependent on that as a business, I guess.
Yeah.
But just being able to have an awareness that I don't always know what people need, and it's not for me to sort of shoehorn their needs into my agenda. It's to listen to who they are and to sort of be with them. And then from that, actually, maybe I can help them, or maybe I can signpost them often. We can get it wrong. We can do too much for people sometimes as well, I guess.
I think that's very much similar to what I'm doing at my work currently. Is like, so for business continuity, basically you would, in an organization, you speak to teams and you basically look at the impact of if they couldn't deliver their work, and you create a big organizational picture of what's critical, what's important. And it's one of these things, is like, there's a side of that is purely maths, like purely administration. And there's a side of that of like actually listening to people's problems and challenges. And as very similar to you, it's not about me solving all those issues. Like, yes, I do, like, if someone raises something that a vulnerability, a concern, I can support them in putting, like, working with the risk team who like create a risk register and that stuff. But actually it's giving someone the place and time to say, this is something I'm really worried about, and like I just need someone to help me take this mental load off that I feel like I'm carrying in isolation. And I find that level of reassurance is actually more beneficial to people than just the heavy documentation. This is what's important, like this is what you can stop doing in a crisis. It's one of those things that I think we need to understand, that kind of mentality, and that's why these conversations are really important, looking at how other people are doing that in other industries. So I've got another question. This is an interesting one. So the whole question is going to be like thoughts on on two things: emotional labor and the use of self. So emotional labor is basically in an incident, it's the kind of effort required to kind of regulate your personal emotions so that you can support someone. So maintaining that kind of like professionalism and like support and able to make critical decisions. On the other side is something called the professional use of self. And what it means is like deliberately using your kind of personal experiences, emotions, as insights in your tool of work. And the reason why I wanted to come discuss this is, you know, this is going out partly for my Women in Resilience Committee. We're obviously sometimes taught that being too emotionally invested, maybe physically showing emotion in work, is unprofessional. And I personally love to like challenge that type of stuff. I think my enthusiasm to want to help people and where that comes from and my faith like makes me better at my job, more dedicated, more focused. I understand that when kind of conveying things to people, like a heightened sense of emotions, maybe not exactly beneficial. But kind of what's your thoughts on like, for you, like you're working with members of your community, it can be quite emotive, it may draw things out of you that you weren't kind of expecting. What's your thoughts on that balance of emotional labor and use of self? And is it kind of something that's like expected for like church leaders and stuff to support people through crisis?
I think that's a really important question to think about, and I think those sort of two terms help to get to the heart of what I think is really important. I think for me, it's some sort of combination of, on the one side, we need to have obviously healthy boundaries, but we can't just sort of shut off from things and just have boundaries. I think we also need some sort of outlet in order to be able to express some of the things that we have. So, you know, if someone was a psychiatrist or a counsellor, they usually have some sort of accountability in terms of people who they're able to then offload and share with. And I think that's really important as well. But also just knowing that it doesn't all begin and end with us. Particularly in a crisis, it can feel like actually I'm the person who's responsible for all of these people. And we need to understand that that's not the case. Now, obviously, the decisions that we make are very weighty. Things are really important. But knowing that actually it doesn't all come down to us is really important. It can be hard to think about that, but from a faith point of view, both of those things help me. So from a Christian point of view, I can think, well, the church is not my church. You know, if I believe that it's God's church, that actually I'm here to help, but it's not about me. So that can be helpful. And then from a sort of an outlet point of view, well, you know, Jesus is the one who says, you know, come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. And so having this sense that actually there's a deeper reason for what I'm doing can be really helpful. Obviously, that is incredibly hard. So, I mean, in my sort of role, vicars and sort of church leaders tend to be on what's called a stipend, which means rather than being sort of salaried for 40 hours a week, you are sort of giving living expenses and often accommodation. But the expectation then is that actually you make your own work. So that could be, you know, that you're working 6 days a week often and at odd hours, and I could be called up in the middle of the night to go to the hospital, or it could be that there's nothing on till lunchtime. And so what that means sometimes is that I've had situations where in the same day I could be having a sort of difficult meeting about fundraising and events. I could be meeting with a couple about a wedding or you know, a baby being christened, but that might be immediately preceded by a conversation where, you know, I'm going to organise a funeral for somebody who's taken their life. And so being able to show
big disparity, isn't it?
Being able to show up for people, going between those different things. Whereas actually, this might be the 5th meeting that I've had of the day, but for that person, this is their life. And so being able to not switch off, you can't pretend those things haven't happened, but to just be able to sort of check in and think, actually, this is really important. I shouldn't be on sort of autopilot for this, but equally, this is really difficult. I think is really important. And realizing that actually we're not alone in that you can't always share the details with somebody if it's a sort of confidential thing, but having good structures of people who you can get alongside, whether that be mentors or whether that be sort of people who can support you, friends and family. In the church, we often have what are called spiritual directors, which will be somebody who I can go to who can sort of help me in my practice. not necessarily in a really formal mentoring way, but just someone who I can go and sort of offload to, that becomes really important, because we are often in situations, particularly if it's stuff to do with resilience, where the burden on us isn't always fair. And in the moment, it's not necessarily about, sometimes we really need to sort of make a stand and put our foot down, but sometimes actually we're trying to spend ourselves on behalf of others. And so I think alongside having those healthy boundaries and sometimes saying, actually, this is too much, we also then need that other thing, which is the outlet, which is the ability to say, you know, I'm going to show up for these people and I'm going to try and help them, but realizing that actually, you know, I can't do everything. And because of that, I need to be myself. So I think, you know, again, in a pastoral situation, I can't be some sort of robotic person who's not real, who just gives somebody all the answers. I need to be myself. Equally, if we're sort of talking about something and I keep bringing everything back to me, you know, then that gets you know, that gets pretty stale pretty quick. So how do you have that balance? Well, you know, if I'm meeting with someone about the you know, about the death of a loved one and a funeral, particularly if I've known that person who's been a church member or something, I might get a bit upset. Now, obviously, if I'm sort of, you know, crying my eyes out and I can't speak, it becomes difficult to be there for them.
Yeah.
But if I was to hide that and be like, oh, this doesn't bother me, well, that's a terrible thing, and it's not true. So getting that balance of actually, I know that I need to be professional, I need to show up for people, but also I'm not going to hide my emotions. I think it's a difficult balance, but I think that's something we can all learn from, and is really important.
And I think like definitely what you're saying about like those around you and the support you can have from those around you is really important. Like I remember doing, and this is one of the reasons I stopped working on call in emergency response, because it was getting so difficult for me as a person who's got anxiety disorder, right? So like you'd have an incident come through where like people would be dying and you're sending staff members out and they're coming back with emotional trauma and you're dealing with them, so you're supporting your staff that you work with every week, so you're very close to, you know, you're hearing stories on the ground, you're seeing loads of like personal information about people, and you're managing that, and there's hours and hours and hours of this, like days potentially, where you go to sleep because you've timed out of your working arrangement, that you're coming back into it. And it is one of those things where, you know, you need to have like that kind of support around you, the people you can go to be able to say, this is overwhelming me, and it's not a tarring of my professionalism, my ability to be able to be resilient. The actual going back to a place of rest is what kind of makes us resilient. The fact that we can have that time to decompress and talk about our feelings, like this is valid and this did happen, and then take our time to move past it, or if appropriate as practitioners say, I need to take a step away from this. That's not failure, that's just rationale. I think that's kind of really, really important.